When my father came to this country and my mum, there were signs saying no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. And then the Labour government outlawed these sorts of signs by bringing in the Race Relations Act. Within one generation, a child of immigrants is the mayor of London. Because by changing the way people behave, it changed the way they thought. They realised actually people of colour are okay, they're like us.
Sadiq, welcome to Rain. How are you?
Well, it's great to finally be invited on Rain. I don't know what I've got to do. Win one election, win two elections. I've got to win 3 elections to get invited on Rain, but thank you for finally getting me on.
Finally. I mean, you had to become a history maker to come on Rain. That's basically what had to happen.
Let's stop now. That's it. History maker, record breaker, landslide victory.
We're done.
No, it's honestly, thanks for having me on. It's really important.
No, honestly, it's so great to have you here. And we're going to get into so many amazing and important topics as well. But before we get on to the politics of today, I wanted to take it back to your very beginnings as a politician.
Sure.
When you first came up in politics, it really was at a time when it was dominated by public schoolboys, wasn't it?
Newsflash, it still is.
It still is. But slowly but surely we're trying to change that. And you were a very welcome antithesis of that. Like, your background was very different. You came from a council flat. You were one of 7 siblings. You shared a bunk bed with your brother until you left home. Your father was a bus driver. I think what's so amazing about that is you have such a strong idea of the sacrifices that everyday people have to make all the time. When did you first think, I'm going to get into politics, and why?
Well, look, when I was, when I was at school, I never met a politician. The idea when I was growing up on the council estate we grew up in that someone like me from my background could be a politician was just unthinkable. When I was growing up, we never knew anybody who went to work in a suit. You know, we knew people who went to work in a uniform. My dad, bus driver's uniform, or people who worked in the rail services or cleaners, but nobody who had a suit to go to work, because that's the sort of estate we grew up in. And so it was unthinkable. But I went to a school. It was looking back now, and people tell me it was a tough, comprehensive school. But I thought it was a great school. The teachers were great. They encouraged and pushed us. And actually, I first wanted to be a dentist because safe profession, right? And I think dentists' loss is probably a gain to dentistry, that I didn't do dentistry. And there's a program on TV when I was 16, 17 called LA Law. It's a bit like, you watch Suits?
Yeah, Suits.
It's a bit like Suits of my generation, right? And I thought, wow, this is so cool, being a lawyer and stuff. And so I changed and decided to become a lawyer. And I love being a lawyer. I just love being a lawyer. What happened, though, is a number of things. Firstly, my dad was a bus driver, as you said. His bus carriage was under threat. My friends and I would be regularly stopped and searched by the police. My teachers at school were going on strike because of Thatcher's policies. And I became politicised in the sense of, why is this happening? And so I took an interest in politics, but never thought I could be a politician until much later. And basically, I'm born and raised in Tooting in South London. And the MP for Tooting, who'd been the MP for my entire life, decided to retire. And I thought I wouldn't mind being the MP for my own area in Tooting rather than going anywhere else, to represent my community in Parliament. I'll tell you something else. The first time I ever went to the chamber of the House of Commons is after I was elected. I'd never been to the chamber. You can go on tours and stuff, but it wasn't a place that I thought was accessible to me, quite intimidating, working class and so forth. But I'd encourage anybody who thinks a profession or a job is outside their grasp to think again, because it's not true. You could be anything by just putting in the hard work.
How did you take your seat at a table in a world that hasn't always necessarily made space for you? What's that look like for you?
Well, it's the same when I was a lawyer. I remember the first year after I became a lawyer, I started speaking posh, right? Because I thought, because you become socialised to the environment. So I had mates who went to certain universities who came back speaking differently to how they went. Because you socialise around your environment. I went to university in London, so it's a different vibe. I went to law school in Guildford, and people, were from Oxbridge and Bristol and so forth. So again, spoke differently to me, but I kept my accent and so forth. But in the first year of being a lawyer, I realised I was speaking inverted commas posh because I was trying to fit in with other colleagues who, were from different backgrounds. And one day a client said to me, "Listen, the reason why, I trust you is because you're like me, you're from my background." And I twigged, actually, I should be authentic and just be myself. And so when I became an MP, again, I realised everyone spoke differently to me. you sort of alluded to my class, and I realised that one of the things that I bring to the table is who I am. So why try and pretend to be like the others to try and fit in? Actually, my USP is being me, and so I'm quite cognizant. I'm quite aware of not hiding my background. So I don't run away from the fact my dad is a bus driver, my mum was a seamstress. I'm the son of immigrants. I'm from a council estate, and so forth, because I want to encourage others from a similar background to realise it ain't that hard. If I can do it, you can do it. But also, I think here's the cunning plan they have, which is people in positions of power and influence try and give the impression it's so hard, only they can do it to keep the joys for themselves. Same goes to media, by the way. You'll hear stories, about people who are in the business because of their mum or their dad, or and it's really important to realise, sure, but actually you can do it as well. And it's really important to give people that confidence, put out ladders for others to succeed as well.
Have you found that your background and where you come from has been the thing that's really fueled you and almost been like your secret sauce in being able to become the politician that you are now?
Yeah, my hinterland is very important. Where I've come from is really important. I still try and see my mum every day. We still live in the same area. We're born and raised in. My siblings are still quite nearby to all of us, and it's very important to us. I still try and pray in the local mosque. I still got my mates from school. That anchor is really important. Look, Josh, and you'll find this in your world as well. It's very easy to have delusions of grandeur. When you get a bit of success, you can get carried away and it's intoxicating. But you need an anchor, particularly in my business of politics, to stay humble, to remind yourself why you're in the job I'm in. I'm in the job because of public service. I want to be the helping hand that helps others to fulfill their potential. And so having that anchor, not forgetting where you've come from, is so important. And particularly at a time where, for understandable reasons, the public are cynical of politicians. There's some apathy amongst the public, and one of the things that I'm so excited about in the new government, aside from the obvious reasons, is a lot of them come from what I call normal backgrounds. Whether it's Keir, whether it's Wes Streeting, whether it's Bridget Phillipson, whether it's David Lammy, whether it's Angie Rayner, their backgrounds are actually the backgrounds most of your listeners have. Actually, the Eton background, the Harrow background, the Oxford background, the Cambridge background is the exception, not the norm. And that's why I'm hoping that the public has more confidence in the new government, because they've lived the experiences your listeners and your viewers have had. But I think it's really important for our country to see people from normal backgrounds in the top jobs, whether it's in media, whether it's in judiciary, whether it's in journalism, whether it's in politics.
You said earlier that when you were younger, you were stopped and searched by police. And growing up in like the 1980s as a Muslim guy in that time was very different to what it is now. And there was so many more racial challenges at that time. When you look back, are you kind of doing it for that younger version of you in a way and the experiences that he had?
Without a doubt. I mean, I think you've articulated in a way that I've not been able to do in this interview so far, is my motivation, which is you never forget those childhood experiences, and they're really important. So those first experiences of encounters with the police, of my mates who weren't the same colour as me but shown allyship, my first experiences of prejudice have stayed with me. They're not an albatross around my neck, because I've also seen the massive progress made in the last 20, 30, 40 years in relation to equality, in relation to law and order, in relation to public services, in relation to allyship and so forth. And so huge progress made, but still, big challenges that I'm determined to address.
We're living at a time where white supremacists and the far right are turning the recent UK riots into an online recruiting pitch. Really, that's what's happening. What role do you think that social media companies have in stopping this? And also when you look at the tweets, like for instance from Elon Musk, who tweeted that civil war is inevitable in the UK in response to a post claiming that open borders migration had led to the protests, or let's call them what they are, riots, they're not protests. And he reinstated Tommy Robinson on X, who was a British anti-Islam campaigner, convicted criminal, and one of the UK's most prominent far-right activists. Like, That's alarming, isn't it, for our society?
Yeah, no, so I've obviously thought about this a lot in the last few weeks. Look, social media by itself isn't the cause of these problems. It's an accelerator. It's a catalyst. We can come to some of the issues around social media. What we're seeing is this. Look, it's the oldest trick in the book to blame the other. We saw it during the Brexit campaign, by the way. We saw it in the 30s. We've seen it recently in this country as well. So if you are somebody that has a child going to a school that's crumbling, if you're somebody who is desperate to get your mum or your auntie to get healthcare but can't get an appointment, if you're somebody who's desperate to get affordable housing, there's two things politicians and others can do. One is to address the legitimate concerns you have. There are legitimate concerns you've got. So to address your concerns and your fears. One is to play on your fears and your concerns. Now, what some politicians, some of the people you've mentioned do is they play on your fears and concerns. The reason, by the way, you can't get decent healthcare, the reason why schools are crumbling, the reason why there's a housing crisis is because of the immigrants. It's the asylum seekers, because we're part of the European Union, because of the other. It's the oldest trick in the book, Whereas the reason why there's waiting queues in the NHS is because the government's not invested in the NHS for a period of time. The reason why schools are crumbling is because the government's not invested in state schools. The reason why there's not enough housing for you and your generation is because we've not built enough affordable housing for you and your generation. That's the reason. We should be saying that rather than allowing people to play in your fears. Now, what happened with the recent riots is there was a tragic, brutal murder of 3 little girls aged 6, 7 and 9 in Southport. 10 other people were injured, including 8 children. And a lie was allowed to spread at rapid pace on social media, giving the impression, actually stating, that the cause of these brutal murders were somebody who'd come on a boat and or a Muslim. And that spread really fast, really fast. And again, go back to a quote that's centuries old. I think it's Mark Twain. A lie is halfway around the world and truth hasn't put its socks on yet, right? But that's on steroids now when it comes to social media. So that lie spread so fast. You mentioned some of the characters involved in spreading the lie for their own purposes. So let's just think about this. These are people with their own political motivations using a horrible, horrible, brutal murder of these children as a way of motivating people based upon their thesis being asylum seekers, refugees, Muslims, people of colour are responsible for this. And that led to a hostel housing asylum seekers being burnt down. That led to mosques being targeted, cars being stopped and checked whether people inside are Muslims or people of colour, police officers protecting minority communities being beaten up and assaulted and so forth. And the amplification was through social media. And the social media companies must have known they were lies, didn't take them down. They must have known that algorithms were amplifying these lies, spreading them wider than Southport, did nothing to stop them. And I think social media companies have a responsibility in relation to making sure the algorithms work in a way that doesn't lead to riots. I'll give you an example. If you or your producer, Amy, or anybody was to put a song on social media now, you sang a Taylor Swift song, right? Or some other artist, Dr. Dre, right? And you were breaching copyright.
Yeah.
That'd be taken out like this.
In a heartbeat.
Right? Because you're breaching copyright, you're breaching intellectual property. But if you were to spew a lie about people of colour, about Muslims, about asylum seekers, it won't be taken down, right? Why? It's because these social media companies, favour the former, not the latter. And I think we should be saying to them, you need to employ staff to take these down. You need to devise AI mechanisms to take these things down. And what's happened is regulation isn't keeping abreast of the evolution in social media. So there is a responsibility in social media companies, but we can't just lay all the blame at their doors in relation to the challenges we've got in this country. And I'll tell you this, think about our country as a rectangle. On the one extreme, you've got people who, in my view, are thoroughly decent people with, good values and who understand, the joy of diversity. On the other extreme, you've got a small number of people who far-right, racist, homophobic and so forth. The vast majority in the middle aren't really sure what to think and are able to be persuaded. And what we've got to do as politicians and as journalists and those who are decent people on this side of a rectangle, decent values, is try and in a non-patronizing way, educate and explain one of the reasons we have the problems. So they know it's not because of the asylum seeker or the refugee or the Muslim or the person of colour. It's for these reasons. Because if we vacate the pitch, the other extreme here will try and occupy the pitch. And what you saw in the last few weeks in our country was the very worst of our country, these riots taking place in parts of our country that were, really scary, but also the very best of our country, because you saw in London thousands and thousands and thousands of people coming together on a night of there's supposed to be riots, showing allyship to Muslims, to minorities. And by the way, those people coming together in London a couple of weeks ago were members of the LGBTQI plus community, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, those members of an organised faith, those that weren't, showing allyship, which is so important.
That's because you said in a tweet that was very impactful when I saw it, and I saw it shared so many times. You said, rightly so, that these riots were fueled by insidious racism, prejudice, and Islamophobia, and it's the legacy of decades of dog whistles, including from some irresponsible politicians. What would you want to say to people who have used hateful words and hateful language for their own gain?
There's a reason why they do it, right? Because they're playing up people's fears, and the reason why there's a reason why they do it is because history tells them they can win elections that way. But when you use phrases like invasion to describe asylum seekers and refugees, when you use phrases like our country's become Islamicized, as was said by the former Home Secretary, when you say things like London is run by Islamists, as was said by the former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, I can give other examples. It normalises this sort of language. It also dehumanises, by the way, Muslims and asylum seekers and so forth, and that gives permission for people to behave this way. And I saw, by the way, during the Brexit campaign, language and behaviour that I thought was in the past coming back to the surface. There's a great line from Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King once said, "We can legislate to change the way you act, but not the way you think. But over a period of time, by changing the way you act, it will change the way you think." And it's so profound. Let me tell you why it's so profound. When my father came to this country and my mum in the 60s, there were signs saying no blacks, no Irish, no dogs on guest houses, on community centres and pubs and so forth. By blacks, that meant anybody that wasn't white. And then the Labour government outlawed these sorts of signs by bringing in the Race Relations Act. Within one generation, a child of immigrants is the mayor of London, right? Because by changing the way people behave, it changed the way they thought. They realised, actually, people of colour are okay. They're like us. Muslims aren't the boogeyman. They're like us. And Londoners were educated in a non-patronising way because of the law being changed to think differently and think we're all equal, right? And my anxiety about Brexit and the poison in the last 10 years by mainstream politicians and others, the mainstream media's got a role to play in this as well, by the way, is it brought to the fore views that were on the periphery and below the surface. And it's brought into the mainstream stuff that was unacceptable. So the P word used against people like me when I was growing up, or the N word, or the Y word, or the W word, is now being mainstreamed again. You see it on social media, you see it being used as terms of abuse by those rioters over the last couple of weeks. And that's heartbreaking because it goes back to the point we made early doors. Rather than being frustrated about the lack of progress, we're now seriously concerned about regression and things going backwards.
As stepping away from being a leader for a second, how did the last couple of weeks make you feel as a person, especially when you have a family that you nurture and you look after as well?
The experience of the last 2 weeks has triggered feelings in me that I thought weren't ever going to, that I thought disappeared. But secondly, what breaks my heart is my children, who'd never experienced what I went through. That new generation, for the first time ever, are scared for no other reason because of the faith they belong to and the colour of their skin, and that can't be right. And so, people who are third generation, fourth generation Brits, because they are Muslim, because they're people of colour, because they're ethnic minorities, they're now scared. Even though we didn't have the riots in London, the ripples of fear we felt in London, and that's one of the things that members of the LGBTQI plus community, women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, we all share, which is the ripples of fear.
Yeah, it's so
when
true.
when we hear about homophobic attack in Manchester, you speak to gay Londoners, they're petrified. When you hear about a race attack in making a place, Southport, people in London are scared because these ripples of fear are felt by all of us because we know our identity tells us, but for the grace of God, that could be me. And that's why the last 2 weeks are so scary in relation to not just, the numbers of people who are injured, the criminal damage being caused, but there are minority communities across our country now who are scared. And that's one of the consequences of the activities of the far right in the last couple of weeks. And that's why your question about social media companies is so important, because they're spreading these messages, they're spreading the hatred, both in terms of, mobilizing, grooming, radicalizing people, but also in terms of the fear it brings the vast majority.
Obviously, when we're speaking about big issues that are happening in our society today, another one is the fact that Donald Trump might be getting back into power. And you've said before that during those 4 years he was president, that led to you having to receive police protection and lots of racial abuse as well, off the back of some of the comments he's made about you. With this being such a pressing issue in our society, in the world in general, how worried are you about the prospect of him getting back into power?
Look, the issue of who the US president is, it's not about me personally and my family's safety and my safety and stuff. So park for a second the consequences of Donald Trump being re-elected on me. Let's just reflect on the last 30, 40, 50 years of progress we've made in relation to equality, right? Much of the progress we've made in terms of LGBTQIA plus rights is because we're inspired by America. The progress made there. Think about Harvey Milk. Think about the Stonewall riots and so forth, right? The civil rights movement in terms of race equality. And so many of my heroes are American, current generation and past generation, right? Whether it's politicians, campaigners, and so forth. And so we can't forget the impact America's had on us in the positive sense of the word. It's really important. They're the beacon of liberty, freedom, human rights, civil liberties, and so forth. At the same time, they can be a negative impact as well on all of us. And so just think about, cast your mind back to the 4 years where Donald Trump was the president of the USA, walking away from climate change agreements. Some of the language he used in relation to describing people who are from the LGBTQI plus community, women, minorities, Muslims, those in South America, his views in relation to NATO, and so forth. This is a problem because the USA is, frankly speaking, the current superpower. We can talk about China and India if you like, but they're really important, and they set the tone for the rest of us. And so the conversation we've had about progress and our frustration about progress is the reason why the reason why I said now we're talking about regression is because, look, Roe versus Wade. What is Roe versus Wade about? It's a Supreme Court case that basically says, women have the right to choose what happens over their own body, right? Why should you and I tell women what they can do with their own bodies and stuff? And Roe and Wade basically gave women the right to control what happens over their bodies and stuff. Because of the judges Trump's appointed to the Supreme Court, they've now overturned Roe versus Wade. So you've got the situation we had in this country in the 60s where women are going to risk their lives if, for whatever reason, they decide to terminate their pregnancy and stuff, because some states won't allow it, and those states can be penalised if they're allowing women to have freedom over their body and so forth. Think about the language used by President Trump in relation to women. And so I think, just as a human being, just as somebody who loves America, just as somebody whose experience has shown that impact America can have for good, of course I'm anxious about Donald Trump becoming the next president of the USA. So forget the impact on me, that the fact that death threats went up and the incitement went up and police protection and so forth. I'm almost irrelevant. And I just think it goes back to the conversation we had earlier on about decisions being made by those that turn up. I'd say to my friends in America, listen, make sure you're registered to vote, man. Make sure you get involved in these elections. Make sure you knock on doors. Make sure you campaign, because it really is important who the next president of the USA is. It really is. It affects all of us. it doesn't just affect those wonderful people living in America. And so, I'm hoping clearly that, Kamala Harris and Tim Wolf's win in November.